The sun rose slowly on a sweltering Chicago day, and the air was heavy with heat, a relentless heat that seemed to blend with the palpable tension floating in the courtroom. The courtroom windows were open, but the air only displaced the heaviness of the day, making the atmosphere even more stifling. The noise of traffic and the murmurs of spectators mixed with the regular banging of the judge's gavel, signifying the progress of the proceedings. The benches were crowded, filled with spectators, journalists, civil rights activists, and simply curious people, all impatient to see the outcome of this affair which would mark the history of the city. Only one name was on everyone's lips: Layla Carter. This trial, which pitted a black woman against the police authorities, was much more than a simple legal matter. It was a test of the system's ability to deliver justice in a context where the color of an individual's skin seemed to be much more of a decision-making factor than the truth of the facts. There was a new energy in the city, an agitation that could be felt even in the air. Layla Carter, the defendant, seemed to embody everything this city had experienced in terms of racial tensions, systemic discrimination, and the fight for human dignity. Layla, a black woman in her 30s, tall, slender, and proudly sporting short curly hair, was accused of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. An accusation which, according to his detractors, seemed as obvious as it was disturbing. But it was a lie woven in ignorance and pride, threatening to destroy his reputation and mark the end of his career. Most of the spectators present had no idea who she really was. The photos on her front page depicted her as a simple woman who seemed to oppose authority, a rebel who was wanted to be shown as dangerous and undisciplined. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that Layla Carter was much more than that. In reality, Layla was one of the most respected and decorated officers in the Navy SEALs, one of the most feared elite units in the world. Every fiber of his being had been forged in the fire of the harshest trials, secret missions and unthinkable challenges that few men or women could survive. She had been trained to remain calm in situations of extreme pressure, to think and act with surgical precision. She wasn't just a fighter, she was an expert, a strategist, an elite soldier. But all this, in the context of this trial, remained a well-kept secret. Because who could imagine that such a woman, a military heroine, could be treated like this, like a criminal by a simple neighborhood police officer? Layla couldn't afford to reveal her identity as a SEAL in this environment. The fight that awaited her would be one of professional life or death, and she would have to fight with the rules of the civilian world, even if they were completely unfair. In the other camp, Agent Paul Riviere, a city police officer in his 40s, displayed an air of confidence that was often found among those who felt at the top of the hierarchy. His icy blue eyes sparkled with excessive confidence and often misplaced authority. The blue police uniform, cut to measure, seemed to embody this authority that he believed to be unshakable. But he had no idea of the extent of the storm he had unleashed by crossing paths with Layla Carter. The scene that led to this confrontation could have taken place in any city, at any time, but tonight it was Chicago. A city where police violence, racism, and social tensions intertwined with a unique density. That evening, Layla had returned home after a long day of training at the SEAL Center. She had just spent several weeks in the field, carrying out secret missions for her country. The weight of these days was marked on his face, but also in the light of his eyes. The mission she had just completed had been delicate, demanding, and returning to civilian reality was always a challenge for her. She didn't like driving after such missions. There was something deeply calming about walking, feeling the ground beneath your feet, being alone in the night. That evening, she decided to walk home. It was pitch black, and the streets were quiet, almost deserted, except for a few passing cars and the distant sounds of the city that never slept. She was in her zone, familiar, safe. Her thoughts were still on the mission, what she had accomplished, and what she had to do next. But she didn't know that this night would become a turning point in her life. While crossing a quiet street, she saw a silhouette in the shadow of a lamppost. It was him. Agent Paul Riviere. He wasn't on patrol, but he seemed lost in subdued anger, as if he was looking for a way to take out his frustration on someone. He quickly spotted her. Layla knew that the time had come to act calmly, not to react impulsively. She stopped when he ordered her to stop abruptly. "You are under arrest," he said in a dry, almost authoritarian voice, but tinged with that annoyance that is often found in power relations. He didn't explain anything to her. "Put your hands against the wall." Layla, even in the midst of a confrontation, remained cold, almost inhuman in her calm. Every fiber of her being was on alert, but she knew that raw aggression was not the answer to the situation. The years of military training were there not only to prepare her to fight in the field, but to maintain iron discipline in moments of extreme tension. She didn't let anything show, every gesture calculated, every movement designed to maintain control of the situation, without giving in to irritation or fear. As she faced Paul Riviere, a part of her carefully observed the policeman's every move. The positioning of his feet, the way he stood, the look in his eyes. It was all part of reading the situation. She had encountered individuals like him before, police officers who felt powerful, omnipotent in their uniform, but who felt threatened as soon as they were asked a legitimate question, a challenge to their authority. "I ask you to explain to me why I am under arrest, officer," she repeated calmly, her voice low, but charged with implicit authority. She knew that this put him in a position of inferiority. The question, although simple, called into question the entire interaction, and what he did with it would say a lot about his own weakness. Agent Riviere, clearly irritated by the audacity of this question, felt confused at first. In his mind, he had already made the decision to control this threat. This woman, black, seemingly calm and reserved, had no place in this neighborhood in his eyes. And when she asked him such a destabilizing question, it only increased his resentment. He didn't like being questioned, especially in a situation where he was supposed to be the one with power. In a sudden gesture, he grabbed her arm, without preamble, hoping to surprise her, to subjugate her quickly. But he greatly underestimated Layla's speed and precision. In an instant, she broke free from his grip, dodging him with the agility of a feline. His years of service as a Navy SEAL had allowed him to acquire a mastery of his body that few men, police or not, could match. She made only one fluid movement, a quick dodge followed by a confident retreat. Paul Riviere, destabilized by the fluidity of the maneuver, felt his ego shatter in an instant. His wrist twisted under the pressure of his failed attempt, and a feeling of humiliation rose within him. He was supposed to be the one in the position of power, the one in control, but he had just found himself at the mercy of a calm, cold, and clearly more seasoned woman. This humiliating defeat in his eyes could not be accepted. He found himself, for a moment, helpless, his authority undermined by a simple question and a perfectly executed gesture of escape. He cursed, but it wasn't just frustration. It was a shame he couldn't stomach. The situation had escalated much faster than he had anticipated. He sought to regain control, but in his mind there was no room for reflection. His emotions, fueled by years of domination and privilege, were too strong for him to think clearly. With a desperate cry, he called for help, his voice betraying his embarrassment. "Help me. This woman. She's attacking me." But no one came immediately. In this neighborhood, where tensions between the police and the population were already palpable, no one rushed to help him. Injustice had become routine, and there was no room for new allies in this game. Paul tried to grab her again, but Layla dodged again, this time with even more ease. She understood that the agent could no longer control his actions, that he was rushing into a spiral of aggression to compensate for his humiliation. Without even breaking her composure, she deflected her arm in one smooth motion and used a sharp, direct punch, targeting just enough to knock the agent out, but not to seriously injure him. Layla had used her expertise to send a clear message without causing unnecessary pain. The agent had just lost to her, and the defeat was her own fault. Agent Riviere fell to the ground, his heavy body hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Around him, the scene seemed frozen, almost unreal. Layla stood there, calm, implacable, like a statue, a figure who refused to give in to indignation or gratuitous violence. She had only reacted to protect herself. The police officers who arrived on the scene, alerted by the cries of their colleague, were immediately disconcerted by what they saw. Their colleague on the ground, quickly getting up, while the woman they had come to arrest remained motionless, calm, without a weapon in her hand. They had seen Layla's behavior before, the stories from neighborhoods where the police faced physical resistance, but they did not understand how this situation had taken such an unexpected turn. There was something in her attitude that told them this woman was not ordinary, but they were not ready to accept it. Their minds were already conditioned to the logic of Agent Riviere, who, despite his defeat, still sought to improve his image. She attacked me, she hit me. She resisted arrest. Paul shouted, in a final effort to turn the situation around, his face red with rage and shame. But his voice no longer had the strength he hoped for. Layla, always calm, said nothing, contenting herself with looking at the police officers who, once again, found themselves faced with an uncomfortable truth that they were not ready to accept. Without hesitation, they arrested Layla. It was the only way to justify the failure of their colleague, the only way to preserve the image they wanted to impose. But at every stage of the arrest, Layla knew one thing. Their attempt to frame her as a violent criminal was only the first round of a much larger fight. A fight she had no intention of submitting to. Weeks after the incident, Layla's case found itself before the court, in a tense atmosphere, where the stakes went far beyond her simple personal case. It was a symbolic confrontation, a battle for the truth in a justice system deeply tainted by racial and social bias. The charges against her were severe: resisting arrest, assault on a peace officer. The outcome seemed uncertain, and even her fellow Navy SEALs, who knew Layla's inner strength well, had no idea how she would cope. In that courtroom, the question was no longer just whether or not she had reacted disproportionately. It was also about whether she could escape the injustice of a system that always seemed to tilt in favor of authority, the white man in uniform, and against a black woman. The affair took place in a climate of skepticism. The simple fact that Agent Paul Riviere was involved in the affair was enough, in the eyes of many, to make his version of the facts credible. His reputation, built over the years, seemed to ensure that he would always be seen as the victim, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. The injustice of the outside world was palpable. It weighed on every aspect of the trial. But Layla was not an easy victim to manipulate. On the day of the trial, she sat in the dock, motionless, a posture that denoted both her dignity and the strength she carried within her. Her black suit, elegant in its sobriety, seemed to bear witness to the person she was beyond what people tried to make her assume. A woman of power, a warrior for peace, reduced to being judged by a system that she knew was unjust. His eyes, focused and intense, scrutinized every movement, every word spoken in this room. She was a piece on a much larger chessboard, and she knew she had to play her cards with pinpoint precision. The trial began. Layla's lawyer, a seasoned civil rights defender, wasted no time. He immediately attacked the inconsistencies in Agent Riviere's testimony. He highlighted the gray areas in his statements, listing inconsistencies that demonstrated a clear attempt to manipulate the truth. But he knew that the main thing was elsewhere. The truth, the one that had not yet been revealed, had to come to light. Layla was not content with being a simple accused. She had the experience, training, discipline, and resilience of a woman who had survived ordeals far more difficult than Agent Riviere and his team could imagine. This trial, although centered on an incident in a deserted street, was to be an opportunity to make her true voice heard, that of a woman who had overcome challenges much greater than those she was accused of. It was then that the lawyer stood up, with a confidence that marked a clear break with the traditional approach to this type of trial. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "my client is not an ordinary citizen. She is a highly skilled and decorated professional, and this trial should not be limited to her actions on this street. It must also include her true abilities and distinctions." A silence instantly settled in the room. All eyes turned to the lawyer, perplexed but intrigued. He pressed a button, and the screen behind the judge's bench lit up. A video appeared. The footage showed Layla in simulated military training, executing defense and counterattack techniques with precision and speed that left people speechless. Every movement, every dodge, every gesture, was of controlled and perfect brutality. The courtroom, usually walled in the indifference and boredom of legal proceedings, was suddenly struck by the indisputable reality of Layla's expertise. The lawyer, seeing the stunned looks of the jurors, continued, Layla Carter is a Navy SEAL. She survived the hell of military training, where few men, few women, even in law enforcement, could survive. She was confronted with situations much more extreme than the one we are dealing with today. If she had wanted to hurt this man, he would not be able to testify here today. The court remained silent. The effect of the video was immediate. The truth, until then eclipsed by the manipulated versions of Agent Riviere, had just come to light. The juror's gaze became more critical, more attentive. The police officer's story was cracking under the weight of this display of strength, skill and control. The room was plunged into a heavy silence, that of the revealed truth, and Agent Riviere felt, at that precise moment, naked, exposed to a light that he had not anticipated. Agent Riviere, who until then had told his story with the conviction of a self-confident man, lost all presence. His eyes, usually full of confidence, seemed to waver. He stammered, tried to resume his story, but his words now lacked force, conviction. The courtroom, which until then had implicitly supported him, began to transform into a place of doubt and uncertainty. The agent no longer had an answer, no valid argument to make. The judge, who until then had observed in silence, slowly turned his gaze towards Agent Riviere, looking serious. "Agent Riviere," he said in a calm but authoritative voice, "you are charged with perjury for lying under oath. You will be referred to an internal investigation." The words echoed through the room like a clap of thunder. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, the murmurs rising like a stormy sea. Layla, still calm, stood up slowly. She did not rush, did not seek to savor the victory. She knew there were still battles to be fought, but this scene, this legal victory, was revenge for the humiliation she had suffered. She turned to Officer Riviere, who stood there broken, his shoulders slumped in shame. "You wanted to make me fall," she said in a calm, almost gentle voice. "But today, it was you who was unmasked." There were no shouts, no exuberant gestures. Justice had been served, in a calm, unvarnished manner. The system had been confronted with the truth, and the truth had triumphed. Layla's trial ended on a note of triumph. The courtroom, which had been the scene of palpable tension, was suddenly enveloped in an atmosphere of relief and justice served. Agent Riviere, who had made his accusations with almost blind arrogance, was not only dismissed from his post, but also charged with abuse of power and perjury. The verdict, rare and fraught with consequences, resonated as a strong message in the judicial system. Impunity would no longer be tolerated, and those who abused their authority would be held accountable. Layla felt a form of peace, but it was not total peace. In regaining her honor and dignity, she knew it was only a small victory in an endless war against systemic injustice. She had won her case, yes, but the broader battle against racism, discrimination, and abuse of power remained to be fought. What Layla had just experienced, what she had just overcome, was only one facet of the enormous structure of inequalities that she was trying to deconstruct. The fight she pursued was not limited to a single injustice, however striking, but to a lifelong struggle, for herself and for future generations. When she left the courtroom, Layla felt on her shoulders the weight of recognition that went beyond this room. The murmurs of the jurors and witnesses were full of respect, but this respect was only the beginning. Out in the real world, there was still so much to do. As she crossed the room, she saw Agent Riviere, now escorted by judicial authorities. He walked, looking dejected, his uniform labeled as a symbol of shame. Layla stopped for a moment, her gaze meeting that of the man who, at one point, had tried to destroy her life. This time, however, there was neither hatred nor distrust in his eyes. It was no longer a confrontation. Layla was no longer the accused, the woman reduced to her skin color or to a false accusation. She was a survivor, a woman who faced adversity with dignity, and the look she gave Riviere was charged with something deeper, compassion. She knew that Riviere was not a monster, but a product of a system that often crushed even those who let themselves be carried away by its workings. Maybe in that look there was a possibility of redemption for him, even if he didn't see it yet. Layla's compassion was not an acceptance of what he had done, but a silent appeal that he would one day understand the scope of his actions. Redemption was not a gift to be given, but an opportunity for him to seize, if he so wished. Layla knew that this road to redemption was long, but she had learned, over the years, that the first step in transforming a man lies in recognizing his humanity, even when he has failed. She then turned on her heel and headed towards the exit, aware that the gaze of the spectators in the room, the respectful murmurs, were not only directed towards the woman who had just won her case. They were also for the one who embodied the possibility of more equitable justice. Outside, Layla took a deep breath. The cool afternoon wind brushed against her face, as if to remind her that the road would still be long, but that she was not walking alone. She thought of all those who, like her, carried the weight of injustice on their shoulders. The voices of the oppressed, the invisible, were the true witnesses of his fight. But today, she had regained her freedom and her honor, and she knew that every step she took from now on, every word she spoke, would be a step towards justice. Layla was not only a woman of action in her military field, she also became an activist for dignity and respect, ready to take this fight far beyond the walls of this court. As she left the place, she felt an inner calm. This was not the end of his story, but a new beginning. She was ready to make her voice heard, to take a stand for others, to break down the walls of systemic injustice, one fight at a time. She knew she would have allies, that others would stand up alongside her. But, for the moment, what Layla felt deep within herself was the certainty of having taken a step towards a fairer, more equitable world. Because every victory, no matter how small, was a step towards transforming this system. And in this fight, she was not alone.